Hello everyone, it's Tom here. Before we get into another brilliant episode of Last Orders, I've got a very special announcement to make. Spiked is about to celebrate its 25th anniversary. And to mark the occasion, we're hosting a bash in central London, bringing together the Spiked team, Spiked contributors, friends of Spiked, as well as the supporters, people who read our work, who donate every month, who really make what we do possible. So if you are a member of Spiked Supporters, our online donor community, you can get early bird tickets to this event, which is on the 27th of February in central London. There are only very limited places, so do move quickly. To find out more, go to the Supporters Hub on the website, and also keep an eye on your inbox because we'll be emailing all of our supporters with this offer. Hope to see you all there. Also, I'm very excited to say that our internship program is open once again. So if you're looking to cut your teeth in journalism, if you're passionate about our pro-freedom politics, please do go to spiked-online.com/interns to find out more and how to apply. No experience is necessary. We're just looking for a hardworking person to join us 5 days a week here in London. It's a paid position and there's also prospects of work at the end of it. Once again, to find out more, go to spiked-online.com/interns. Hello and welcome back to Last Orders. I'm Tom Slater, editor of Spiked, joined as I am in every episode by my co-host, Chris Snowdon. How are you doing, Chris?
Very well, thanks, Tom. Hope our listeners are doing well too.
As do I. We're also delighted to be joined by Luke Gittos, who's a columnist for Spiked, also the director of the Freedom Law Clinic. How are you doing, Luke?
Good, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Not at all. We're delighted to have you on, not least because we wanted to talk about freedom of speech, about the crackdown on social media posts. I mean, we're recording this the day after the Southport killer, Axel Ruda-Cabana, was sentenced to a minimum of 52 years in prison. It's a topic that we talk about on the Spike podcast this week. But one thing we wanted to get you on to talk about was what happened after Southport, which was not the arrest and apprehension of the killer, not even the crackdown on the horrendous violence and riots that gripped the country afterwards, but what was going on online, people who were having their collars felt for posting inflammatory, offensive, inciting, as far as the law is concerned, tweets and memes. And this is something that you've been very much involved in, on top of the other hats that you're where you also have been manning the Free Speech Union's hotline that was set up in the wake of the Southport unrest for people who found themselves having their collars felt, looking for legal advice. I know you can't talk about any of the specific cases, but with some sort of broad brushstrokes, what has been your sense of this issue in the wake of Southport?
Yeah, so one thing I would start by saying is that the law in this area is extremely broad, and it gives a lot of power to the police and then to Crown prosecutors to decide what is lawful and what isn't. So by way of example, you can in theory be arrested for a criminal offence if you are seen to be stirring up racial hatred online. And that can, a lot of the time, involve quite nebulous things that people are saying. So we've seen some examples of people pleading guilty really quite early on. So within maybe a few weeks of being arrested. And they're usually doing that on advice from their lawyers who say, well, look, you did say something which could breach the law. If this goes in front of a jury, they're likely to take a very dim view of you. And it's probably best if you throw up your hands at the earliest possible opportunity, because that means you get a reduction in your sentence. And so we have seen quite a lot of capitulation, understandable capitulation on behalf of individual defendants who probably want to avoid the pressures of a trial. We've seen people saying, for example, things like, they should all get out of here, things that seem to be hinting towards hostility towards a particular ethnic group in light of Southport. And some of the examples you perhaps would readily accept should attract the ire of the criminal law. So there have been a couple of cases involving direct incitement towards, for example, burning down mosques and saying we should meet outside here and burn down this mosque. And I think most people would recognize that that is probably an appropriate use of the criminal law. You can't have people out attempting to directly incite violence or extreme disorder, or at least, if people do that, it's perhaps understandable why the authorities want to intervene. But what we're seeing now is the first cases where people haven't pled guilty. And so we have currently got cases going in front of juries for the first time, and we are seeing some acquittals. And, the jury cannot be controlled in their decision making. You are inevitably going to get 12 people on that panel who live in the communities that are affected by some of these issues. They will bring their own experiences and points of view to the question that they're being asked. My hope is that the juries will start to see through, or will bring some understanding to the question of people's legal guilt that perhaps wouldn't have been possible if people plead guilty at the first available opportunity. We're dealing with very broad laws that have been applied very broadly. And in some circumstances, some proper cases have been brought. But I think in a lot of cases, you're looking at things which most people would consider a fair use of their freedom of expression.
And there's a lot of different cases which are often lumped together sometimes in this discussion, not necessarily very helpfully. I mean, in the wake of Southport, there were some individuals who were being given relatively short sentences, but for things like grossly offensive memes. There was a gentleman in Cumbria who was put in prison for a number of weeks for posting essentially kind of racist material on his Facebook page. But I think many of the cases which have attracted much longer sentences and which have spurred much more discussion are ones that, as you say, are far more extreme than there's sometimes the discussion would lead on. It is people saying, burn the mosque down for all I fucking care. These kinds of statements, and in some cases, as you're saying, much more, what could arguably be much more direct forms of incitement, actually using social media as a genuine rallying point for real world violence. There has been this unfortunate tendency. Sometimes it's just hyperbole. Sometimes it's just people speaking in broad brushstrokes as if people were being locked up purely for voicing disapproval of immigration or something like that. And that meme has taken place. Nevertheless, I think people do have a more straightforward concern about, shall we say, the kind of severity of the punishment. You've got someone sounding off to the equivalent of their friends on Facebook, saying something inflammatory, something deeply unpleasant. Could it really be considered direct incitement in the way that standing in front of a mob was? People talked about the case of Julie Sweeney, this woman in her 50s, who again made one of these kind of inflammatory comments to a relatively limited number of people and has ended up with a very long prison sentence as a consequence of that. Is that a place where some of those concerned about this issue do have a bit more ground, which is that at the very least something which might have drawn the attention of the authorities, might even have needed legal intervention, that the punishment has just been excessive in proportion to the statements and the crimes that have been committed? Is there grounds there, would you say?
Yeah, I think that's right. So the offence is stirring up racial hatred using threatening, abusive or insulting language. And even looking at the wording of the law, you can see the potential for abuse there, the idea that you can commit the offence in theory by using insulting language with a specific intention. But when I looked at the sentencing authorities, so the decisions that around sentencing that have been challenged, that's a way that you can get into the facts of some cases that have gone before and look at, the kind of thing that was targeted by this law before Southport. And really, again, the kind of cases that made it through to the Court of Appeal were really strong cases. They were people using very strong anti-Semitic language, calling for very serious violence in publications that they would hand out on the street. There's one case around the Brexit referendum where someone was repeatedly posting direct incitements to violence against immigrants, specifically, just everyday economic migrants, and posting it repeatedly on Twitter. And in those circumstances, you can see why the law had to intervene. I think what we will see in the Southport cases is a slight lowering of that bar, that the prosecution allow for much softer language to meet the standard of insulting, threatening, or abusive. And one really interesting thing about this offence is that the element of intention can be judged on the circumstances in which the comments were made. So what we have seen in some cases around Southport is the prosecution saying, well, because of the time that this language was used, it makes it likely that racial hatred was going to be stirred up. In other words, something that was said in the immediate aftermath of Southport is a crime because of when you said it. Now, to some extent, that makes sense in that what the prosecution is saying is that, well, because this all occurred at a time when racial tensions were perceived to be high, the fact that you then took to the internet to say X, Y, and Z in that context makes it more likely that you intended to stir up racial hatred. But it does allow for the kind of threshold as to what language is used to come right down, because suddenly things that were perfectly lawful to say previously, because of the circumstances in which they're being said, can transgress the criminal law. So we'll see how these cases play out. They'll go before juries. The juries will consider the evidence and make the decisions. But I do think if there is going to be a break placed on the use of the law in this way, then juries could be essential to that.
Absolutely. Chris, anything you want to ask Luke here or say in response to that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's right. It'd be interesting to see what the juries do. And I don't know what, particular tweets or Facebook posts they're going to be looking at. But, there is, no one's better to take the law into their own hands than the jury, I suppose. And you keep seeing, again, this week, a bunch of just up oil idiots got let off from something that they were filmed doing and basically admitted doing because the jury supported their cause. So we shall see. I mean, I would just say that, incitement to violence, along with threats, harm, and libel are my exceptions to free speech. I think you should say anything else. But I think at the end of the day, they're still only words. Sticks and stones, I think, still applies. And so I would set the bar pretty high for these incitements to violence, as indeed we do with libel. You can call people names. It's not, you're not going to get done for libel. You have to show a certain amount of harm has been caused to your reputation and earnings. So, it's not as if you just can't say anything untrue about somebody. Similarly, I think incitement to violence needs to be credible. There needs to be a realistic chance that somebody would follow through with it. So if it's just a comment that is obviously made in anger or half jokingly to about 3 or 4 people, then, I mean, I don't think there's any realistic case of harm. And I think if you prosecute people like that, it looks like you're almost doing them for thought crime. But they're clearly, I do remember seeing, Facebook posts or Twitter posts, which went well beyond that. And I think the authorities are right to intervene. But it's a bit of a balancing act. So all I would say is I would set the bar pretty high. Otherwise, we're going to see a lot of people in prison for basically just losing their temper in a way that was never realistically going to incite anybody. And a final reminder that being incited to be violent is not an excuse.
No, absolutely. I mean, just to tack on to that, Luke, is it significant that all of the lengthy sentences, all of the big cases that we're talking about have been around incitement to hatred, which is a much more kind of loaded term? I mean, I roughly understand that in British law, incitement to hatred is seen as a very kind of similar offence to incitement to violence. They're kind of seen as akin to a certain extent. But isn't that part of the problem here, is that that's instantly a much more nebulous concept, whereas in America, where you don't have hate speech laws in the same way, you have incitement to violence that has a very clear, very high standard. The speech has to be likely and intended to cause imminent lawless action. This is something which has been hammered out very clearly by Supreme Court. Whereas in the UK, we have this notion of incitement to hatred, which by dint of the fact that it references not just action, but emotion effectively, it becomes instantly more nebulous, more open to becoming a much broader category, being broadly interpreted in times of national crisis, what have you. Is that part of the problem here, is that our law lacks the kind of clarity on free speech and is generally more censorious than, say, in America?
Yeah, I think the First Amendment means that the Americans would be very reluctant to introduce any law that sought to limit people's power to convince anyone of anything, even if that thing was to hate a particular minority group. In this country, we take a different view. We don't have a constitutional, or at least a written down constitutional right to free speech. We have our European Convention right under Article 10, but the UK state is given a very broad remit to decide what that means. And, the European Court of Human Rights just would not intervene, or has not intervened in the past, to deal with cases where criminal courts regulate speech. It would be very difficult for them to take that role because of the margin of appreciation, as they call it, that the UK court is given to interpret and enforce their own laws. So the big problem here are the pieces of legislation that criminalize incitement to hatred. I think you're right that it's a nebulous concept. And there has in the past, I think, been an understanding that in order to cross the criminal threshold, it needs to be a really egregious example of direct incitement to hate a particular ethnic group. And so the more nebulous that becomes through the law being enforced more sporadically or more selectively, I think that's a real problem. And as I've said before, if you look at the case law around this, then you can see the kinds of cases that used to come up and compare them to what is being prosecuted now. And I think there is quite a marked difference. I think that there can be a role for the criminal law to regulate and censor really extreme uses of speech. But for all the reasons you've suggested, it needs some very strong safeguards. And I think part of the problem is we don't have the kind of safeguard in this country that the Americans have in the form of the First Amendment.
No, we've got plenty more to talk about, but I suppose just very finally in a nutshell, it was striking that not only was the police just going after people who they believed had committed the law, you also had the CPS and government Twitter accounts foghorning, think before you post. Is that something that you've kind of detected when dealing with some of these cases, that people are genuinely fearful that they will be arrested, have their collars felt, not for extreme speech, but for just voicing opinions and concerns? Has that chilling effect set in from what you can tell?
It's difficult to know. So we did get calls from people saying, I'm worried because I've posted this opinion about asylum in the immediate aftermath of the Southport attack. I'm worried because I posted comment beneath a video that turned out to be spreading misinformation. There were lots of people who were concerned, but those people haven't been arrested. We should put some qualification on this. It's not been, people have used the term kind of mass clampdown. I think that's overstating it. And I think once you see these cases getting into court, you'll see that a lot of them are on the borderline of what would be considered acceptable. So perhaps a jury's consideration is all proper. Was there a chilling effect? Well, I think there was, and I think there was a lot of anxiety about what people were posting. And I think the think before you post stuff, the justification for that would have been that as our law stands at the moment, it can be easy to transgress. It can be easy to fall foul of the law in this area. And so it was right for people to think before they post in some respects. By the same token, I think that's the problem with the laws that we have, that often it's important to be able to have these debates and discussions in a way which does not involve people being worried about being arrested for what they say. And so what would be useful is some more guidance and some kind of, I sound a bit like Keir Starmer here, just calling for things to have more statutory guidance. But there could be an argument to say, look, there should be a presumption in favour of not prosecuting unless X, Y, and Z circumstances apply, and you can imagine requiring a greater degree of scrutiny over the circumstances in which people will be arrested for this. And I think there might be some movement in that direction, because as I say, the real risk is that the fact that the law is so broad, the fact that the law is there at all and can allow people to be arrested, I think some degree of chilling effect is inevitable.
Right, let's move on and talk a bit about Trump's America, the kind of post-Trump moment, particularly as it relates to this podcast, Chris, because amongst the kind of flurry of executive actions that after the inauguration, the Trump administration has pushed through, is withdrawal from the World Health Organization, one of your bête noirs, one of the bête noirs of many people following the COVID circus. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about this? I imagine you're in favour, but do you want to put a bit more meat on the bone as why that's the case?
Very, very much so. It's a big one, as he said himself. I don't know if you've seen the video of him being handed it. He said, "What's this one?" He says, "It's withdrawing from the World Health Organization." He goes, "Oh, that's a big one," and happily signs it. The World Health Organization is unreformable. It's incompetent and it's corrupt. I have a particular bugbear with it. Well, various reasons, but obviously, he does spend a lot of time getting involved in Westerners' lifestyle, when it still has quite a job of work to be doing with infectious diseases in poorer parts of the world. So I find that annoying. I particularly get annoyed by the endless tweeting about e-cigarettes, which they were doing again this week, and which, as always, attracted a community note. I just think it's probably bad if the World Health Organization is constantly being corrected for misinformation on social media, But also, of course, it has, not unrelatedly, actually, it has dropped the ball so many times on infectious disease and particularly on COVID. Now, I suspect that Trump is not withdrawing from the WHO because he doesn't like their position on vaping. And to some extent, he might be doing it for the wrong reasons. But, he thinks that it's too close to China, which was kind of proven, I think, during the pandemic and since, in fact, because the WHO has made very little effort to try and find the source of the virus. Did this kind of pathetic guided tour around the Wuhan Institute of Virology. It wasn't really allowed to see anything or ask any questions, and then said, "Oh, that's the end of that story." It probably came from America on some frozen meat. Well, no, they didn't say that, but that was a Chinese story at the time, if you remember. So, look, it's good, and it's a big chunk of money for the WHO to lose. And you would hope that if it loses 20% of its budget, which is what we're talking about here, it will decide it's going to concentrate on the things that are most important. I'm not sure that will actually happen, partly because a lot of the lifestyle-related stuff that it deals with is privately funded, particularly by Michael Bloomberg, who, as listeners will know, is a multi-billionaire nanny-state fanatic. Part of me thought, when Trump did this, that someone like Bloomberg would just step in and say, "Oh, we'll make up the shortfall." And then I saw how much America was giving to WHO. It's nearly $700 million. So even someone like Bloomberg is probably not going to be able to fork out that kind of sum every year. They're looking like they're going to have a permanent shortfall in the budget. I just hope that Keir Starmer doesn't try and do his, global Britain thing of saying, "Oh, we'll chip in a bit more money," which is in fact what Boris Johnson did when Trump did this before. Remember, he did this during COVID in 2020. I don't think it actually ever went through because I think he then lost the election and Biden changed his mind. But that was the plan. So this is a long-standing thing for Trump, and he has followed through, and good on him.
And I know we've talked many times on this podcast, you've written extensively about how warped the WHO's priorities are towards lifestyle, away from things like infectious diseases, which really should be their remit. I mean, absurd stories of, former director generals attending vaping conferences as Ebola rips through Africa. This has become a kind of running joke. But is there any truth to the concerns that with America pulling out, that this is going to have a kind of real impact on the ground for, say, developing countries that might be reliant on some of this largesse?
Only if the WHO decides to go in that direction. As I say, they spend a huge amount of money on things that they shouldn't be getting involved in. They also spend a huge amount of waste. When I said it's corrupt before, I mean, the kind of first-class flight scandals and various expensing things around the WHO. There's been a lot of stories about that over the years. No, I think it has more than enough money to deal with the things it should be dealing with. But ultimately, I just think it needs to be replaced. It would be nice to reform it. That would be the obvious thing to do. But they had a chance of reforming after COVID. Dr. Tedros is still in charge. You would think the least they would do would get him to fall on his sword and say mistakes were made, we're under new management, which is what FIFA did. Not very convincingly, but they did do it. And I see the two organizations as being very similar, actually, in all sorts of ways.
Well, I mean, I admired Trump's day of bonfires in his executive orders, seemingly dismantling so many of those presumptions about the way government should be done. Because I think the WHO is very symbolic in that it represents a kind of global leadership program run with the UN that seems in the hearts of so many of those kind of technocrats to be so essential to making the world run smoothly. We often forget that these institutions depend on elite loyalty and not much else. They don't have to make the case for their existence to the public very often. They don't have to kind of prove through their impact that they're making a big difference. The public obviously has very little control over what they do and don't do. So I think Trump's move is a blow against that way of doing politics, which I think is welcome. I mean, there's a question over, firstly, whether what he did was lawful, because the US joined the WHO through an act of Congress. And can the president simply undermine that through executive order? There's some doubt about that. So we'll see whether that decision is challenged. There's also a question over whether this is one of Trump's bargaining positions. Later on in that same announcement, when he was sort of giving that impromptu press conference about every executive order that he was signing, it seems to be giving the press what they want on the hoof. He said that a lot of this was about money and the contributions, and also about the way that the WHO seemed to take advantage of Biden in asking for 500 million or whatever it was. And then he said, well, we'll see what they come back with, or words to that effect. In other words, this might be him saying, withdrawing for the purpose of getting America a better deal to be members. So we'll see how serious he is. He uses tariffs in the same sort of way, right? So he'll say, I'm going to whack tariffs on all sorts of things in the hope that he then gets a better deal in the particular area that he's working with. I mean, Chris will have a better idea as to whether some of the catastrophizing that has arisen as a result of this decision is well-founded. So the idea that it will hamper America's ability to deal with particular diseases, or it will hold back information sharing. I don't have a sophisticated understanding of how effective the WHO is at what it purports to do. Chris, what do you have a view on that?
Yeah, it's been useless at everything I can think of. It wasn't just COVID, it was Ebola, it was Zika. I mean, every time you get a new virus appear in Asia or Africa, they mess it up quite badly. So, they're not doing the job properly, not entirely because they're too distracted about looking at, reformulating biscuits and putting a tax on sugary drinks. But it shows what their priorities actually are. And it shows a gross mismanagement of its resources. And look, I mean, the WHO is subject to a lot of mental conspiracy theories as well, which is what I mean when I say Trump might be doing this for the wrong reasons. I see he's also released the JFK files as well, which is quite interesting. Apparently, most Americans think that Oswald did not act alone, or may indeed have not been involved with it whatsoever. It's kind of interesting. There's millions of files, and nearly all of them have been released, but that still leaves thousands, which the CIA and the FBI said last time Trump was in office, he wanted to release these files, right? And the FBI and the CIA persuaded him not to release his final few thousand. So it will be genuinely interesting to see what's in these final few thousand. If it turns out there was a conspiracy, I may have to review my entire way of looking at the world.
Absolutely. And it's not just JFK. I think it's JFK, RFK Sr. and Martin Luther King.
Yeah, well, why not? It's been long enough, hasn't it, really? All those people pretty much are dead. So yeah, let's find out. It would be cool if there's something in there. It's more likely to be just stuff that's embarrassing, I would think, rather than anything implicating or suggesting a conspiracy. But bring it on.
Unless there's any more on the WHO, should we talk a bit about Labour, Chris, and their dash for growth, which seems recently to have been colliding with their dash for net zero? You've had a lot of discord within the Labour Party this week because Rachel Reeves has indicated that she would back Heathrow expansion, which has naturally not gone down very well with the more environmentalist factions within her party. After coming into power claiming a laser-like focus on growth, the economy has posted essentially zero growth during that entire time. Do you think we're at the beginning of a sort of a realisation on the part of the Labour Party that maybe they can either have growth and then they can have net zero, or they can't have both? Do you think that's the penny starting to drop now?
Yes, I do. And I think it's only a matter of time before Ed Miliband is nudged out. It'll take a while because they are still quite committed to the whole Great British Energy thing. But it will have to go eventually because the targets are obviously so unrealistic. We nearly had blackouts in this country 2 weeks ago. So the plan for growth, whatever he calls it, involves new runways at not just Heathrow, but also Gatwick, I hear, which is good for me where I live. And they're going to be bypassing lots of environmental laws if they need to, if they feel they need to. They're only going to allow one legal challenge to planning applications, which is excellent if they do that. And they sacked the head of the CMA, Competition Mergers Agency. It used to be called the Monopoly Commission, because when you remember a few weeks ago, they said that they're going to ask the regulators to give them some ideas on how to get growth, which maybe not the best people to ask. Anyway, Reeves was not impressed with what the CMA came back with there, which presumably was like, let's have some more regulation and bureaucrats. So to be fair, she used him as a sacrificial lamb. So it's a good symbol, but talk is cheap. If you see, you look at how quickly Trump did all this stuff, and it takes this government 6 months just to tell us what the plan is. Trump had 4 years to think about it. Labour had 14 years. It's remarkable how slow they've been. There's still no plan for the NHS. The plan for social care is not going to be out until 2028. It's incredible, really, how slow they've been, even to provide us with some policies. Now, if these policies do come through, they will be very, very good. It's exactly what people like myself have been calling for a very long time. But I will not be holding my breath, because it feels to me as if almost like the government hasn't even changed. We've had 6 months of Labour introducing one Rishi Sunak policy after another, and we still haven't finished. We've still got things like the football regulator to go. And then we get announcements saying we're going to go for growth and we're going to relax planning laws. Well, how many Tory MPs said the same thing? And nothing ever happened because of vested interests and backbenchers. And we've already seen the Lib Dems have kicked off about Heathrow. I've heard the third runway plan being criticised for creating regional inequality. Oh, it's not fair because it's in the south of England, so much for levelling up, blah, blah, blah. In addition to the inevitable complaints about greenhouse gas emissions, the fact of the matter is you've got to be brave, you've got to have a big majority, and you've got to be committed to doing it. They have got a big majority. They might feel brave, particularly if the theme in this is just going to be a one-term government, unless they really get some growth going. So look, I really genuinely wish them well, but they're going to have to face off a huge amount of opposition to get things that everyone really, every sane person knows need to be done.
And the third runway at Heathrow has taken on such symbolic importance in that respect, because there's always arguments about, do you prioritise Heathrow over the other airports, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's so important that someone at some point manages to build this fucking runway. Like, for longer than any of us have been alive, governments of various hues have been trying and failing to do this.
They've been talking about it since the 1950s, I believe. Just give every airport extra runway. That's the fair thing to do, isn't it? That'll be levelling up.
Exactly. Luke, what have you made of Labour's travails in the last few weeks?
Well, just sticking with Heathrow, I mean, if you read the Supreme Court decision, which decided that the decision to grant a runway was actually lawful So the Court of Appeal had decided before that the Tory government, as it was at the time, hadn't done everything it needed to do in order to approve this plan. Then the Supreme Court said, oh no, actually they did do everything they needed to do, therefore it can go ahead and it's lawful. But reading the judgments of these two courts, you can just see the maze of legislation that governs the way that our government make decisions. So every single decision they take has to be lawful and needs to be in accordance with the statutory criteria that they themselves have created. So I think that's a big reason why all of these steps take so long, because any minister trying to make a decision has to say, okay, right, what law do I have to check to make sure I'm making this decision correctly? And then if he gets that wrong, he risks judicial review, which can mean a huge cost to the taxpayer, because the taxpayer is who will end up paying it. You know, with something like Heathrow, there's so many steps they have to take in order to be able to even make a decision that it can become very difficult to do so. So thankfully, when the Supreme Court said that actually the government had done everything that it needed to, there was a feeling that this opened the door for some progress in this area. But I mean, Chris mentioned the proposals to reduce the number of planning challenges that can be brought in the courts. I think there would need to be some really quite radical limitations on how these challenges are brought, but also just giving ministers more powers to make decisions that they think are politically correct and politically right.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I wanted to ask you, Luke, is, I mean, it strikes me that there's a lot more required here than just Starmer saying we're going to start doing things different. You presumably need to repeal quite a bit of legislation, including possibly the European human rights legislation, because you've seen just this week, I can't remember what it was, it's some welfare thing the government was doing. It was cutting benefits for somebody or other, and it went to court and it was said to be illegal because it was sexist, because it affected women more, something like that. You know, and we see these cases all the time. So I think most people would say that we are suffering from this kind of lawfare and judicial activism more than anything. And in order to deal with it, you actually need to repeal or at least change the laws, right?
Yeah, you'd need a very comprehensive repeal of lots of pieces of legislation going back 50 or 60 years.
But is Starmer the kind of man to do that? I mean, he's a human rights lawyer.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, the one thing Starmer is good at is law. I mean, he is a good lawyer and he knows this stuff, but he's not the kind of person to rock the boat significantly. He's not the kind of person to radically reform the role that the judiciary has come to play. I mean, he is basically a Blairite, and Tony Blair was largely responsible for example, you know, introducing the Human Rights Act, but also expanding the role that the judiciary plays in these kinds of decisions. If you look at, you know, there was a marked change in the role that judicial review in between sort of the late 80s and the late 90s, where more and more challenges were brought to decisions made by ministers that never would have reached the court in the past. You know, there was always a kind of sensible constitutional understanding that the judiciary dealt with really only essential matters of law, where there was a real clear reason for the judiciary to get involved. And the rest of it was kind of executive decision making. But then you had a lot of discussion in the 90s and early 2000s about the kind of dictatorship of the executive or something similar, where the idea became that actually the government has way too much power to make decisions without any oversight. And so the judiciary just started creeping in. And part of that was lawyers being more keen to bring these kinds of challenges, get them in front of judges, and also the judges themselves kind of adopting that role. And I think many within the judiciary would say that it's a role that judges shouldn't be doing. And a lot of them are very nervous about it. Jonathan Sumption, for example, his Reith lectures are great on this, you know, kind of the mad expansion of the law into more and more areas of our lives. But, you know, while there are lawyers willing to take these cases up, there will always be a lawyer willing to find a reason why something is unlawful. And Chris, you mentioned, is it sexist? Is it, you know, does it favour one part of the country over the other? All of these are potential ways in which lawyers can become involved. And until you repeal those mechanisms, you're still going to have these problems.
Right, before we get to the final question that we're going to ask Luke here, Chris, you wanted to soft launch a new section on this podcast, Letby Corner.
You see Letby Corner.
Where you can address some of your critics, address some of the developments in this ongoing miscarriage of justice, as some people would say it. We've taken a very different line on this podcast, but yeah, what's the latest?
Well, I only suggested talking about it because Luke has written for Spiked about how she is clearly guilty. And it feels almost like the contrarian take at the moment that somebody who's in prison for 15 whole life sentences should be actually guilty of the things she's been convicted of. I'd love to see some polling on that, by the way, because you get a very slanted picture from social media, which is what I rely on. No, the only thing I wanted to mention, the Furwell inquiry has now stopped taking evidence. The final witness was the eminent statistician, Professor Sir David Spiegelhalter, who's always very good. And the Letbyists, the pro-Letby people, they've been calling for ages to have a statistician on. And they thought there should have been statisticians called in the original trial because they mistakenly think it's all about statistics, which is the thing that got me into writing about this in the first place, was just it's not about statistics, and it really annoys me when people say it is. But Spiegelhalter did some back-of-the-envelope calculations about how likely it was that you would see this spike in deaths at the hospital. So it turns out the average number of neonatal deaths in the hospital before Letby started a spree, less than 3, about 2.5, I think. And then you had 8 in 2015 and then another 5 in 2016, and she was convicted of 7 murders. And he said that the chances of there being that many deaths up spike in 2015 was 0.008 is how he put it. Pretty unlikely, but not so unlikely that it wouldn't happen on average probably once a year in Britain. Right, so it certainly wouldn't be enough to, by any means, convict somebody. But it was very unlikely, and then you got another spike, admittedly a smaller one, the following year. But the other thing he didn't mention is that we now know that of the 13 deaths that took place, Letby was there for 12 of them. That's not to say, obviously, that there were 12 murders, but she happened to be there for a disproportionate number of the non-suspicious deaths as well. So I wonder if someone were to go to court on the basis of statistics, I wonder what the chances were of there being a spike that big and one nurse being present for 12 out of the 13 deaths. I would imagine that we're talking somewhere in millions to one, which again still doesn't convict her. And there's a reason the prosecution didn't bring someone like Spiegelhalter on, is because it was a relevant case. They didn't need to make any kind of statistical argument. And similarly, there's a reason the defense didn't call a statistician to the case, because it wouldn't help her case at all to have somebody turn up saying, actually, it's really unlikely that this would have happened by chance. Possible, but really unlikely.
Luke, I'm not sure if you've got any particular views on the statistics part, but just anything that you've been sort of struck by as this debate continues to rumble on and seems to be intensifying in some respects.
So I think, Chris has made all the points about statistics. I mean, the statistical issue really was an afterthought in the prosecution case. It was an illustrative device, that famous graph or the table that says she was on duty for X, Y, and Z. I mean, that was kind of the cherry on the cake. It didn't, of the prosecution case. It kind of completed the story. It was miles away from the key evidence that convicted Letby. And I think, we should always, my position has always been the same, which is that keep an open mind to the possibility that prosecution witnesses might change their mind about what happened, and the scientific consensus might shift very, very dramatically, and it will turn out to be one of the great miscarriage of justices of our time. All of that is possible, but at the moment, on the scientific evidence, it seems completely cut and dry, and nothing that will ever be said about statistics will alter that.
Yeah, I'd be more open to the idea that there's been a miscarriage of justice if all the people who were saying there has been a miscarriage of justice weren't either barking mad or very obviously wrong. Did you see the conference by his new barrister?
Oh, yeah, I did.
He brought along this neonatologist from Canada who made, on the face of it, quite a convincing and certainly a very emotional case for how one of the babies died. But then when he looked into it, he got things very basically wrong. I mean, aside from anything else, his hypothesis had been raised in court and rejected, and it was explained by an expert why it didn't happen like that. So every time supposedly some new evidence has turned up, I've looked into it with an open mind, and there's been nothing there every time.
Yeah.
But it'll run and run, won't it, Luke? It
will run and run, and it will probably end up saying more about our current kind of relationship to the truth and finality than it will do about the truth of the guilt or otherwise of Lucy Letby.
Yep. More on this in 2 weeks in the next episode of the Lucy Letby show.
So before we let you go, Luke, because this is a very libertarian anti-ban podcast, we do ask our guests to answer one final question.
You are a dictator.
If you had to have one ban, what would it be? The only condition is that it can't be worthy. You can't ban a liberalism or knife crime or whatever it might be. If you had to have one ban, what would it be?
So I'm a relatively new father, and I have a 3-year-old and a 12-month-old. So I spend quite a lot of time in soft play areas. And my ban would be parents using their phone in a soft play area. And the reason for that is not because they're taking pictures or doing anything weird, but it's because everyone wants to go to the soft play just to sit on their phone, right? Everyone would love to be able to do that as a parent, because it's a great little window for you to turn off your brain. But the problem is that then the parents who aren't on their phones get these glommy kids. I call them glommy kids. They kind of glom onto you as a dad that's in the soft play. And suddenly you end up looking after 2 or 3 kids while some parent is out looking at their Instagram or, sexting their mistress while you've got to look after their kids. And, you look down at these poor children saying, give me some attention, give me some and I really, when I go to a soft play, it's bad enough that I have to play with my own kids without having to play with someone else's.
Can't the kids play with each other? Isn't that the point?
That should be the point, yeah. But sometimes that just doesn't happen. And
just go on your phone then.
Yeah.
If you can't beat them, join them.
No, I know. Maybe that's the solution. But I also think that in general, you should have to suffer with every other parent in that soft play to an equal extent. And I think it's fair that my ban will force parents to engage with the soft play rather than retreating, which I think, maybe you're right, Chris. We should just leave them to it. And that probably in a previous generation is probably what we would have done. But we do live in a very child-centered age now, and sadly, I'm a part of that.
Well, commiserations.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
A very good band as well. It was impassioned. It was very specific. No notes.
It wasn't about people getting in our way in London, which makes a change.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Luke, Chris, thank you very much.
Yeah, cheers.
You've been listening to Last Orders. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please do take a moment to leave us a rating and a review. And if you'd like to support the show, why not become a Spiked supporter? Just go to spiked-online.com/supporters to sign up. That's spiked-online.com/supporters.